The afternoon sun beat down as James pulled into the Westwood Grand Hotel parking lot. He drove slowly, careful not to hit the brakes too hard. His service dog Max was in the back seat, and James always tried to make the ride comfortable for him. The large German Shepherd sat patiently, his intelligent eyes watching James's every move. "Almost there, buddy," James said softly, finding a parking spot near the entrance. James was tired. The 5-hour drive from his hometown had drained him, and his back ached from the old injury he'd gotten during his second tour in Afghanistan. But he had promised his childhood friend he'd be there for the wedding tomorrow, and James never broke his promises. As he stepped out of the car, James took a deep breath. Crowded places still make him nervous even after all these years. His therapist had called it progress that he could even attend a wedding now. 3 years ago, he couldn't even go to the grocery store without having a panic attack. "Come on, Max," he called, opening the back door. Max hopped out, immediately moving to James's left side. The dog wore his official service vest, bright red with patches that read "Service Doggy" and "Do Note at PET." James double-checked that Max's papers were in his wallet. He'd had problems before with people questioning his need for a service animal. Just because you couldn't see his scars didn't mean they weren't there. The hotel looked fancy, all glass and polished stone. James felt a bit out of place in his simple jeans and button-up shirt, but he straightened his shoulders. He'd faced worse than fancy hotels. "Let's get checked in and rest a bit," he told Max, grabbing his overnight bag from the trunk. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. A tour group had just arrived, filling the space with loud chatter and rolling suitcases. James felt his heart rate pick up. Max sensed it too, pressing gently against his leg. A silent reminder that he wasn't alone. James took another deep breath and headed for the check-in desk. The line moved slowly. James checked his watch. It was already 4:30 p.m. He'd hoped to get settled and maybe grab an early dinner before calling it a night. Tomorrow would be a big day, and he needed to be rested. A woman in front of him turned and noticed Max. Her eyes widened, but then she smiled. "Beautiful dog," she said. "Very well behaved." James nodded politely. "Thank you. He's my service animal." "I figured," she replied. "My brother has one too." "Army?" "Yes, ma'am. 8 years." "Thank you for your service," she said, genuine warmth in her voice before turning back around. These small moments always helped James feel more at ease. Not everyone understood, but enough did. When it was finally his turn, James approached the desk. A stern-looking man in a crisp suit stood behind the counter, a gold name tag that read "Robert Taylor, Manager," pinned to his jacket. "Good afternoon," James said. "I have a reservation under James Wilson." Robert barely looked up from his computer, his fingers tapping at the keyboard. Then his eyes dropped to Max, and his whole demeanor changed. "Sir," he said, his voice suddenly cold, "I don't see any pet-friendly rooms available." James felt his stomach tighten. He'd been through this before. "He's not a pet," he explained calmly. "Max is my service dog. I noted that in my reservation." Robert's eyebrows rose. "A service dog? For what exactly?" The question hung in the air. Around them, the lobby had gotten quieter, as if people were listening in. James felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the beginning of anxiety creeping in. Max pressed closer to his leg. "I have PTSD," James said quietly. "I'm a veteran. I have all his papers right here." He reached for his wallet. Robert let out a small scoff. "PTSD? Really?" He looked James up and down. "You look fine to me." James stood at the reception desk, his throat tightening. The hotel manager, Robert, stared at him with cold eyes that seemed to dismiss his very existence. Max, sensing his growing tension, pressed closer to James's leg. "I have his certification right here," James said, pulling out his wallet. His fingers trembled slightly as he removed the folded papers. "Federal law allows service animals in all public accommodations." Robert barely glanced at the documentation. "Everyone has papers these days," he said with a dismissive wave. "You can download them off the internet. That doesn't make every pet a service animal." The lobby had grown quieter. James could feel eyes on his back. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd spent years trying to avoid. His heart pounded in his ears. "Max isn't a pet," James explained, working to keep his voice steady. "He's trained to help with my PTSD symptoms. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan." Robert's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Afghanistan, huh?" He looked down at Max again, then back at James. "Funny, you don't look like you have any problems to me." A woman standing nearby gasped softly. James felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment, but from the effort of containing his reaction. He'd faced this before. The invisible nature of his condition meant people like Robert felt entitled to question its existence. "Sir," James said, lowering his voice, "I don't need to explain my medical history to you. I just need to check into my room." Robert leaned forward slightly. "This is a high-end establishment. Our guests pay good money for comfort and cleanliness. We can't have animals shedding all over the furniture." "He doesn't shed," James replied automatically, though he knew that wasn't the point. A young man behind the counter, his Namadag-red Tom, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced between his manager and James, clearly troubled by the interaction. Robert noticed and turned to Tom with an exaggerated eye roll. "Another one trying to bring their pet everywhere," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "These invisible problems are very convenient, aren't they?" James felt his chest constrict. The familiar tightness was spreading, making it harder to breathe normally. This was how it always started: the racing heart, the shallow breathing, the feeling of being trapped. Max recognized the signs immediately and performed his trained response, moving to stand directly in front of James, creating a buffer between him and the perceived threat. Robert pointed and laughed. "See that? It's just tricks. A real service dog would be more professional." The ignorance of the statement would have been almost comical if it weren't so hurtful. Max was doing exactly what he was trained to do, helping James manage his anxiety symptoms before they escalated into a full panic attack. An older couple waiting in line exchanged concerned glances. The woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded gravely. "I'd like to speak to another manager," James said, his voice strained. "I am the manager," Robert replied, straightening his jacket, "and I decide who stays at this hotel." Tom, the young employee, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He glanced toward a door marked "Staff Only," as if hoping someone would emerge to help. "The law says," James began. "I know what the law says," Robert interrupted, "but I also know a fake service animal when I see one. That dog is clearly just a pet you've trained to do a few tricks." Max remained perfectly still, focused entirely on James, exactly as he'd been trained. Years of specialized training had prepared him for moments like this, though James had hoped they wouldn't face such blatant discrimination at a place like the Westwood Grand. A small crowd had gathered now, some guests openly watching the confrontation, others pretending to be occupied with their phones while stealing glances. "Why don't you stay somewhere more suitable?" Robert suggested, his tone dripping with condescension. "There's a motel about 10 miles down the highway that might be more your speed. I hear they don't ask many questions there." James felt the room closing in. This wasn't just about the hotel anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and the right to exist. The lobby had grown uncomfortably quiet. James could feel sweat forming on his forehead as Robert continued to stare him down. Max remained perfectly still beside him, doing his job despite the hostile environment. "Let me see those papers again," Robert demanded, holding out his hand with a snap of his fingers. James handed over the documentation a second time. His hands were steadier now, not because he felt calmer, but because years of military training had taught him to function even when everything inside him was chaos. Robert made a show of examining the papers, turning them over and squinting at the official stamps and signatures. Then he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the documents. "What are you doing?" James asked. "Documenting this for our records," Robert replied without looking up. "We need to protect ourselves from liability." A woman in a business suit who had been watching the scene stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said to Robert, "but taking photos of someone's medical documentation without permission is a privacy violation." Robert glared at her. "Are you a lawyer?" "As a matter of fact, I am," she replied calmly. Robert hesitated, then reluctantly handed the papers back to James. But he wasn't done yet. "Fine. You can stay," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But the dog stays in the service corridor when you're not in your room. We can't have it disturbing other guests." James took a deep breath. "That's not how service animals work. Max needs to stay with me at all times. That's the whole point." "Oh, come on," Robert scoffed. "You expect me to believe you need this dog every minute of every day? For what? Bad memories?" He made air quotes around the words "bad memories," drawing a few nervous laughs from people who didn't know better. James felt his chest tighten again. Max immediately responded, pressing against his leg and looking up at him. The dog's warm presence was the only thing keeping him grounded right now. "You've got him doing tricks again," Robert pointed out to the onlookers. "Watch, everyone, it's quite the show." He clapped his hands slowly, mockingly. Tom, the young employee behind the counter, looked mortified. "Sir," he said quietly to Robert, "I think we should." "You think we should what?" Robert cut him off. "Let anyone with a dog claim it's a service animal. Next thing you know, we'll have cats and parrots, and who knows what else running around this place." James closed his eyes briefly. The room was starting to spin slightly. This was getting bad. "I just need my room key," he managed to say. "Oh, sure," Robert said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "The veteran needs his special room now. I'm sure you'd like a discount too, right? Because of your service?" Several people gasped. Even those who had been passively watching looked shocked at this new level of disrespect. The lawyer woman stepped closer. "Sir, I strongly suggest you complete this guest's check-in immediately." Robert ignored her, keeping his eyes fixed on James. "You know what I think? I think you military types just can't handle regular life. You come back and expect everyone to treat you special because you chose to go off fighting somewhere." James felt something shift inside him. The anxiety was still there, but now anger rose alongside it, not the destructive kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you're standing up for something important. "I don't expect special treatment," James said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I expect the treatment guaranteed by law. Nothing more, nothing less." A few people in the lobby began to nod. An older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap gave James a subtle thumbs up. Robert's face flushed red. He clearly hadn't expected resistance. "Well, the law says I can ask what tasks this so-called service dog performs. So go ahead. Tell us all exactly what this dog does that's so important." It was a humiliating request, made deliberately to force James to explain his most private struggles in a public space. But Robert had miscalculated. James had spent years in therapy learning that his condition wasn't something to be ashamed of. "Max alerts me before panic attacks," James said clearly. "He provides pressure therapy during episodes of anxiety. He wakes me during nightmares. He creates space between me and triggers in public. He reminds me to take my medication." James paused. Just as Robert was about to say something else, a tall woman with short gray hair stepped forward from the crowd. She wore a simple navy blazer with a small pin on the lapel, the scales of justice. "I've had enough," she said firmly. Her voice wasn't particularly loud, but it carried authority that made everyone in the lobby turn to look. "My name is Patricia Taylor. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights law, and I'm currently staying at this hotel for the National Bar Association conference." Robert's expression changed instantly. The smugness disappeared, replaced by something closer to caution. "This is a private matter between the hotel and a guest," he said, his tone notably different than moments before. Patricia smiled thinly. "It stopped being private when you chose to humiliate this man in your lobby. What I've witnessed here is a clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in places of public accommodation, like hotels." A young man wearing headphones around his neck stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I've been recording this for the past 3 minutes," he said. "My channel has over 200,000 followers. People need to see how veterans get treated." Robert's face turned pale. "Recording isn't allowed in the hotel," he stammered. "Actually," the young man replied, "there's no signage indicating that, and we're in a public area. I checked the hotel policies on your website before I started recording." An older couple who had been watching everything unfold now approached James. The man wore a cap identifying him as a Vietnam veteran. "Son," he said to James, "I went through similar things when I came back. Nobody understood what was happening in our heads back then." He turned to face Robert. "But things are supposed to be different now. We're supposed to know better." His wife nodded. "We're checking out," she announced loudly. "We can't stay at a place that treats heroes this way." The lobby was now buzzing with conversations. Several other guests were taking out their phones, either recording or appearing to send messages about what they were witnessing. Tom, the young employee behind the counter, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He kept glancing toward the staff door, clearly hoping for someone to intervene. A middle-aged man in a business suit approached the desk. "I'm here with the Johnson wedding party," he said. "We have 15 rooms booked for the weekend. I'd like to speak to someone about possibly relocating our entire group to another hotel." Robert's eyes widened in panic. The Johnson wedding was one of their biggest bookings of the month. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "There's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Patricia the attorney interrupted, "is your apparent belief that you can ignore federal law without consequences." James stood quietly through all of this, one hand resting on Max's head. The dog remained perfectly calm, doing exactly what he was trained to do, providing steady support amid chaos. Another hotel employee emerged from the staff door, a woman in her 40s wearing a management badge that read Lisa Chen, Assistant Manager. She took in the scene quickly, the crowd of upset guests, Robert's flustered appearance, James and Max standing quietly at the center of it all. "What's happening here?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. Before Robert could answer, at least 3 different guests started explaining simultaneously. Lisa held up her hand. "One at a time, please," she said, then turned to James. "Sir, perhaps you could tell me." James explained the situation briefly, his voice steady despite the anxiety still churning inside him. Lisa listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "I understand," she said when he finished, "and I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience or discomfort you've experienced." She turned to Robert with a look that could have frozen water. "Mr. Taylor, I need to speak with you privately. Right now." Robert started to protest, but Lisa cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Tom," she said to the young employee, The tension in the lobby shifted as Lisa Chen took control of the situation. Her calm, professional demeanor was a stark contrast to Robert's hostility. The crowd parted slightly as she guided Robert toward the staff door, her hand firmly but discreetly on his elbow. "Tom, please help our guest immediately," she called over her shoulder before disappearing with Robert into the back office. Tom's hands shook slightly as he typed on the computer. "I'm so sorry about all of this, sir," he said to James. "This isn't how we're supposed to treat guests, especially not veterans." James nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the last 15 minutes. Max remained by his side, a steady, calming presence amid the chaos. Behind the office door, Lisa's voice rose just enough for those nearest to hear snippets of her conversation with Robert. "Company policy, federal law, absolutely unacceptable behavior." Tom finished the check-in process and handed James a key card. "You're in room 412. It's one of our best suites." He lowered his voice. "I wanted to say something earlier. I should have spoken up sooner." "It's okay," James replied. "Standing up to your boss isn't easy." Several guests were still watching, some with their phones out. The young man who had been recording approached James again. "Hey, I'm David," he said. "Like I mentioned, I have this video, but I won't post it without your permission. It's your story to tell, or not tell." James thought for a moment. Part of him wanted to just go to his room, lock the door, and forget this ever happened. But another part, the part that had survived war and came back determined to make a difference, knew this was bigger than just him. "You can share it," James decided. "Just blur my face if possible. This isn't about me specifically, it's about respect for veterans and people with disabilities." David nodded. "I understand. And I'll make sure the video focuses on the issue, not you personally." Patricia, the attorney, was speaking with the older Vietnam veteran couple and several other guests who had witnessed the scene. They exchanged contact information, and Patricia jotted down notes in a small notebook. The office door opened, and Lisa emerged alone. She straightened her jacket and walked directly to James. "Mr. Wilson," she said, using his name for the first time, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received today. It was unacceptable and doesn't reflect the values of our hotel chain." Her apology seemed genuine, not the corporate damage control kind, but the human-to-human kind. "Robert will not be interacting with guests for the remainder of your stay," she continued. "I've also notified our regional manager about the incident." A few people in the lobby nodded in approval. The atmosphere had changed from tense to something more hopeful. "What about your service animal policy?" Patricia asked, still in lawyer mode. "Will there be any other issues during his stay?" Lisa shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. Our policy fully complies with the ADA. Service animals are welcome in all areas of the hotel where guests are permitted." She turned back to James. "And may I add, your dog is exceptionally well trained. It's obvious he's a legitimate service animal." James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For once, someone had recognized Max's training without him having to explain or defend it. "Thank you," he said simply. Lisa handed him a business card. "This has my direct number. If you need anything during your stay, anything at all, please call me personally." The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama subsided. Some people stopped to pat James on the shoulder or offer quiet words of support as they passed. The Vietnam veteran gave him a respectful nod that spoke volumes, the silent understanding between those who had served. Tom came around from behind the counter. "Let me help you with your bag, sir. I'll show you to your room." As they walked toward the elevator, James noticed how differently the hotel staff now treated him, with a mixture of respect and the slight embarrassment that comes after witnessing an injustice and failing to prevent it. In the elevator, Tom spoke again. "The hotel restaurant serves dinner until 10 p.m. We also have room service if you prefer privacy." "Thanks," James replied. "I might just order in tonight." Max sat between them, alert but relaxed. To anyone watching, he was just a well-behaved dog. But to James woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop. It was just past 7 a.m., and he had dozens of notifications, text messages, emails, and social media alerts. He rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of it all. Max lifted his head from his spot at the foot of the bed, watching James with alert eyes. "What's going on, buddy?" James muttered, scrolling through his phone. The answer became clear within seconds. David's video had gone viral overnight. The clip showed Robert mocking James and dismissing his service dog, with James standing tall despite the humiliation. The video ended with Lisa stepping in and the crowd's supportive reaction. The hashtag Westwood discrimination was trending nationwide. James sat on the edge of the bed, stunned. One text caught his eye, from his friend Mike, whose wedding he was in town to attend. "Just saw the video. You okay? The whole wedding party is talking about it. We're all behind you." While James was sleeping, the internet had been wide awake and furious. The video had over 2 million views already. News outlets were picking up the story. Veterans groups were sharing it with angry comments about how those who served were treated. Disability rights organizations were using it as an example of discrimination. His phone rang. It was Patricia, the attorney from the lobby. "Good morning, James," she said when he answered. "I imagine you've seen what's happening online." "I'm just catching up," he replied, still scrolling through endless notifications. The hotel's corporate office released a statement at midnight. Patricia told him, "They're in full damage control mode. I thought you should know. I've received calls from 3 major news networks wanting to speak with you." James hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted to check into a hotel and attend his friend's wedding. "I don't know if I want to talk to reporters," he said honestly. "That's completely your choice," Patricia assured him. "You don't owe anyone your story. But if you do decide to speak out, I'd be happy to help you prepare or even be present during interviews." After they hung up, James took Max out for a quick walk. In the hotel hallway, other guests recognized him immediately. Some offered supportive nods or quiet words of encouragement. Others awkwardly looked away, unsure what to say. In the lobby, everything had changed. A different manager was at the front desk, not Robert. Staff members were wearing small pins with paws on them that hadn't been there yesterday. As James and Max crossed the lobby, Lisa spotted him and hurried over. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "I was hoping to catch you this morning. Our CEO would like to speak with you, if you're willing." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. "He'd flew in from Chicago early this morning," Lisa explained. "This situation has reached the highest levels of our company." Outside the hotel, a small group of veterans had gathered. They held signs reading "Respect our vets" and "Service dogs save lives." A local TV news van was parked across the street. James's phone buzzed with another call, this time from his mother. "Baby, are you okay?" she asked as soon as he answered. "I just saw you on the morning news." "I'm fine, Mom," he assured her, though fine didn't quite capture the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling. "Your father is furious," she continued. "He's calling everyone he knows to complain about that hotel." James couldn't help but smile. His dad, also a veteran, had always been his fiercest defender. Back in his room, James opened his laptop to check his email. There were messages from people he hadn't heard from in years, old military buddies, former classmates, distant relatives, all of them expressing support and outrage at how he'd been treated. One email stood out from the rest. It was from a veterans support group he'd volunteered with occasionally. "James, what happened to you is happening to veterans every day. Would you consider speaking at our next meeting? Your story could help others stand up for their rights." James looked at Max, who sat patiently watching him as always. This quiet, loyal animal. Two days after the incident, James stood in a conference room at the Westwood Grand Hotel. Beside him sat Patricia, the attorney who had stepped up in the lobby. Across the table were 3 people: the hotel's CEO, William Parker, their head of public relations, and Lisa, who had been promoted to head manager after the incident. "Mr. Wilson," William began, "first, let me personally apologize for what happened. It was inexcusable and goes against everything our company stands for." James nodded, one hand resting on Max's head. The dog sat calmly beside his chair, ever vigilant. "Robert has been let go," William continued. "But we know that fixing this goes beyond one person. We're implementing mandatory training for all staff across our 200 locations. The PR director slid a folder across the table. We've prepared a statement announcing these changes, along with a donation to the Veterans Service Dog Foundation. We'd appreciate your input before we release it. James looked at Patricia, who nodded encouragingly. I didn't want any of this attention, James said honestly. I just wanted to be treated with basic respect. That's exactly why your story has touched so many people, Lisa said. It wasn't just about a service dog, it was about dignity. Outside, the story continued to spread. The video had reached over 10 million views. News outlets had picked up the story, featuring interviews with veterans who shared similar experiences. Hashtags like #RespectServiceDogs and #InvisibleWounds were trending alongside #WestwoodDiscrimination. After reviewing the hotel's statement, James added one request. I want to help with the training program, not just here, but at all your locations. William looked surprised but nodded. We would be honored. 6 months later, James stood at the front of a hotel conference room in Dallas. 40 hotel employees sat before him, with Max lying calmly at his feet. Not all wounds are visible, James explained to the attentive audience. And not all disabilities require a wheelchair or cane. Over the past months, James had traveled to 15 hotels, sharing his story and helping staff understand how to properly accommodate guests with service animals. The Westwood Hotel Group had created a comprehensive training program, which was now being adopted by other hotel chains. Robert, the former manager, had eventually issued a public apology after losing job offers when potential employers recognized his name. In an unexpected turn, he had reached out to James, asking to meet and apologize in person. That meeting had been tense but healing. Robert had admitted that the incident forced him to confront his own prejudices. He was now volunteering with a veterans organization, learning firsthand about the challenges former service members faced. The video that David posted had become a teaching tool in hospitality schools. Patricia had used James's case to push for stronger enforcement of accessibility laws. The Veterans Service Dog Foundation reported a 300% increase in donations, allowing them to place more trained dogs with veterans in need. As for James, his life had changed in ways he never expected. The confidence he gained from standing up for himself, and then for others, had helped him manage his PTSD symptoms better than any medication. He still had bad days, but Max was always there, and now so was a community of supporters who understood. After his presentation in Dallas, a young hotel employee approached him. My brother just came back from overseas, she said quietly. He's struggling but won't admit it. Hearing your story, maybe it will help him accept help. James handed her a business card, not his personal one, but one for the Veterans Support Network he now worked with part-time. Tell him he's not alone, James said, and neither are you. Later that evening, as James and Max walked through the hotel lobby, every staff member they passed greeted them with genuine respect. No stares, no questions, no judgment, just the simple dignity that everyone deserves.